Welcome to Beyond Possible Club podcast. And today we're diving into a topic that's a big interest to any athlete and performer or even non-athlete can relate to it. It's the topic of performing under high pressure. And my guest today is Adrian Plavsic. He is a former NHL defenseman, Olympian, and now a mental fitness coach. Adrian, it's an honor to have you today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. Used to this stage in some way, a little bit different, but really looking forward to sharing and exchanging and see what comes up. Amazing nuggets and content will come out of our conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dive in. Let's start from the beginning. So you were a second round NHL draft pick. So you played 8 seasons in an NHL and you won Olympic a silver medal for Canada. What was this journey like for you?
Well, I guess the journey started when I was a young kid and just in Montreal, everybody was exposed to the Montreal Canadiens, and I loved watching Hockey Night in Canada. I remember at age 10 really telling myself I had this such an emotional peak state. I said, this is what I want to do. I told myself that. And I mean, that was my life. Outdoor hockey rinks in Montreal when it got cold, organized hockey and street hockey in the summertime. And eventually, I guess it paid off. Yeah, I saw myself moving up the ladder.
Yeah. So you performed at that very high level, but I remember you mentioning that a lot of the times you felt like it was still in that, a lot of pressure and survival mode. So take us back to that. How did it feel internally for you to perform at that high level at the NHL and Olympics?
I think what happens is when we're kids, we have this natural freedom because we're not so filled with data, with conditioning. So our experience is one that's very spontaneous. And I knew over time, even when I was 14, 13, I started noticing that I would get really anxious. So I had a tendency to have a worried mind, to overthink. But obviously, as a 14-year-old, I started getting really good because I was putting in the reps and playing a lot. And I think that was my advantage. But as you go up and you get all of a sudden, I'm drafted in the NHL, everybody's better. So now you're on the big stage. And so everything internal will just get magnified even bigger. So any fears you have, any limiting beliefs, and I think that's really what happened is that the external environment is the way it is, but everybody experiences differently. And so mine was, there was a lot of anxiety, which tended to, oh, I want to over prepare, make sure that everything's perfect, but there's no way of being able to do that. And I think it just wears you out when there's that energy of anxiety, which is fear, and the part of the brain which is tied to survival is overly active. So I definitely had that going on.
Yeah, kind of like sounds like peak performance on the outside, but there's so much turbulence and stress on the insides happening that you're overcoming. So in light of your life experience being at the peak and now working with people who are either there or working on playing to get there, how do you personally define success?
Well, I would definitely define success is that your ability to be present in the moment. So being able to capture the moment while, performing at your best. But it's really interesting because the more present you are, the more you're going to tap into your resources because you're connected. You're really tuned into your senses, you're tuned into the environment versus being in your head and overthinking. So I had the overthinking going on, which created all kinds of emotions. So in some way, the more chaotic, or the more activity there is going on within someone, the less they're going to be able to capture the moment and be able to perform and bring their best in the moment. You can still have a level, I think, of achievement, but I still think the fulfillment part will be missing, because the fulfillment really comes from being able to live that moment fully, like a child, just loving, wow, I'm so enthralled in that book, or I love, swimming in the water. They're so connected to that, and everything else ceases to exist. But when you're in your head, it's the other way. You're like worried about scenarios, what will happen. The personal self starts being overly active, the ego, and then you're cut off from the experience. You're cutting yourself off from living the experience fully.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so as you're describing it, I just got this image that I never made that metaphor connection before. I imagine like the camera, like even our phone or any sort of camera that captures photos or videos, and the lens is dirty. And I felt like as you're describing, I just got that image. It's just like when you have all this internal interference and that, mind chatter and worry, like you're not able to take, like to take it all in, to take pictures, and you're cut off from like your best performance. I remember in one of conversations, you mentioned that you even didn't have a clear memory of being at the Olympics, that you don't fully remember what happened because of how much pressure you had in your mind. And now obviously you work to help other athletes to avoid that experience. So how do you do it? How would you help somebody to be present?
I would just say it's about removing what you call the interference. So how do you do that? You got to create stillness. So I believe that that's our original state. If you look at a child that has all of a sudden has an emotional, like something happens, there's anger, they come back to equanimity very, very quickly. So I believe that that's our natural state. And I think stillness, really cultivating stillness through different exercises, breathing. What ends up happening is that if we're thinking too much and there's a lot of interference, which shows up as resistance, blocks, barriers, the the body's natural innate ability to learn, that's what kids do effortlessly. They learn because there's no interference. No one gave them a manual to learn to walk, to learn languages. I know kids who 5 languages, and they're doing it with such ease because there's no interference. So to me, it's removing the data. Like, what's the beliefs? When I say data, it's the conditioning. What's someone believing? Like, what's the data in there that's creating that experience of like, oh, there's a cost to this. What if this happens? What if that happens? So it's stillness and cultivating that, I think, is sort of resetting the system, resetting your nervous system, and it's calming the mind. So there's a sort of purification that happens.
So what are some practical steps that you would teach to help people to get into that stillness and what's we often call flow state?
Mhm. I would say the biggest one, however you do that, the method you choose is start being the observer of your thoughts. Start being the observer of your reaction. So something happens, and say birds are making, noise. We interpret that through our senses. And then all of a sudden we'll create a meaning out of it. Okay, birds, that's a really simple one. but then there's more complex things. But now all of a sudden, take for example, someone triggers us or we get triggered in traffic, and then there's an internal, like an automatic reaction that happens, and we react. Well, if we react, if the response and the reaction are the same, we're in patterns, we're functioning in patterns. You're guarantee you're going to keep repeating
Autopilot, you mean like you kind of like just
autopilot.
autopilot? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's changing that reaction that you get, and then the response. So being the observer means you got to catch it. You got to develop. That's why stillness is the thing. The tool is to be able to catch it and see, okay, man, I'm like triggered, but I'm mindful, I'm conscious, I'm not asleep. What do I want to do with this? And what you'll see is that really it's about you. It's not about the event, it's about you. Something's being triggered for whatever, and you, if you dig deep enough, you can go deep down the rabbit hole. But as you have this approach, you'll start to see that you'll start, that's where power is. You'll have this ability to respond differently. And I think that's part of rewiring patterns and changing yourself, and cleaning up what's sort of, you said, cleaning up the lenses.
Lenses.
Yes.
Cleaning up the interference. Yeah. So, and as you're describing it, I'm thinking, to be able to do it, especially in hockey, when it's so high pace, it's so fast, you cannot practice while you're already on the ice. You have to practice. I would assume like you have to practice everywhere else in traffic with your spouse. Like how do you help clients build that habit? Like maybe is there a certain tools, there's certain programs, like how do they learn to build that, mental muscle of stopping and the autopilot and being an observer while they're already in a very fast-paced environment?
Yeah, great question, Yulia. I would say awareness. So the observance is tied to awareness. And if you go high enough, and you say the helicopter view, if you can have that perspective and start gaining and looking at things from that perspective, you're gonna, the awareness is something that kicks in. The more you use it, the more it will kick in. And you'll start to realize, like, I've had this, this happened to me. So all of a sudden, you're in traffic, and maybe I look down, or I've changed something and the car stopped and my head lifted. It's almost like something told me, okay, lift your head. So the way I see that is, if you know the inner game of tennis, talks about self one, which is the ego, and the ego, as the ego gets developed, the personal self with all its story, baggage, and everything going on, it starts getting in the way of this natural operating system, which we have, which kids use in an optimal way. Well, the ego all of a sudden carries all these fear and starts interfering and goes, okay, I don't trust my operating system. So it's really about developing this trust again with yourself, with life, having the faith that if you do the work, and you prepare, there's got to be a letting go and saying, okay, I have to let go and trust whatever the outcome is, I will get something out of it. And I think that's living in this paradigm, is that life is serving you. Life is working for you, not against you. I don't know if there's another way of saying it, but yeah, life is really your friend. It's trying to teach you through your experiences. So trusting that because we didn't create ourselves. So for me, I realized when I played, the more I tried to control, the more I was in fear, the more I tried to control, and the less control I had. And when I got into flow, it's like, holy smokes, just happened. You know, I'm skating up the ice, full speed, guy coming right at me, straight on, and he would go left, I would go right. Like, what part of me knew that? Not the conscious mind, not the conscious mind. It's this
Mhm.
unconscious process, this self too, which just knows it, it senses. And so trusting that. And I love the way the inner game of tennis explains that relationship, which is so key.
Yes. I like how you didn't jump in into very specific tools. So do this mindfulness, do that. Like I ask you like about practical, but you like, no, like let's zoom out. I like that you went into bigger picture of first of all having a certain level of beliefs about life and your place in this life rather than like, okay, let's do this mindfulness exercises and it's going to have like, so that's just shows at the higher level that you approach things, that you work with your clients to make sure that they have a bigger bird view, first, and then you can plug in kind of all the tools and techniques into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely has to make sense for them. There's so many tools out there. You know, it's what is it work? What's the thing that will help a client shift? You know, someone all of a sudden they just have a different experience. So it's the difference. We're so saturated with information and tools, but what about the experience? But once you have an experience of letting go, you know, of trusting, that means it's wired, it's in your body. You can always go back, and that's where I think transformation and a paradigm shift happens. So I truly believe that that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what we want. We all sort of want the same thing. We want to be more free. We want to trust ourselves more in the process. We want to be more of ourselves in every situation, even under pressure. Imagine being under pressure and you show up and you go, wow, I'm trusting myself. I can be myself. But what ends up happening is we have all these beliefs attached. So we're trying to adapt and
Yeah. So not to get wild, there is a very high pressure situation to remember that freedom and being able to access that freedom without like completely being consumed by fear. It's interesting because just in the last couple of days, there is like more turmoil that's going on in the world generally with conversation about like political and economical negotiations that countries are going through. And I had to pull myself a couple times away from social media because you just like, I get so consumed needing to know, needing to understand that so much fear comes up right away that I was like, walk away. Just remember, like you just remember you cannot directly affect it right now. And whatever happened before, I have trust in humanity. We're gonna figure it out. We're gonna learn from it. And so yeah, so what was the turning point for you personally in your performance when you chose to look differently at what performance is? It's not about like pushing and trying harder and learning to access that freedom. When did it happen for you?
well, I don't know if there's one turning point really. I think when I started in my career, you know, 1920, playing for the Canucks and like sleepless nights, anxiety, going like just having to deal with that whole thing, it just consumes so much of my energy. So I started reading, you know, first step is self-exploration. Um, but really interesting in this journey, even though you achieve, you know, I've gotten a silver medal, a world junior gold, won titles. If you don't deal with the root of the issue, the issue remains. No matter how many titles, no matter what role you're holding, you know, your CEO, whatever, it doesn't matter. So the whole thing is to what's at the root of this. And I think, I learned later over time, I started really realizing that, there was some things, some hidden determinants that were driving my behavior and that were like motivating me to achieve, but they left me feeling a certain way. So there was the fulfillment part, and like you shared that, well, I couldn't remember a lot in the Olympics because I was so consumed. But over time, you realize that, as hockey ended and I had to transition, what I was left with is me and my relationship to me. So your internal, that never, your what's going on with you, that's sort of the real gem, is like if you can, you know get that to work optimally, everything else becomes sort of okay. Life's a playground. What do we want to do now? What's captivating us? What's interesting? What captures our attention? Our unique, authenticity, who we are. So I think that is the key. And I think I'm a slow learner. I definitely have to say. It
You a
just,
late bloomer, you mean?
yeah, late bloomer. So like fall on your face, fall on your face, fall on your face. And then
Oh.
eventually there's like, I think there's a certain pain can do a lot. It's an amazing teacher. You get enough pain, you go, okay, now it's time to change. So often it's like the ego wants, okay, I want the results, I want that, but I'm not willing to do the real work. I'm not willing to look deep down inside, like what's really going on here. And ultimately, I think we all carry wounds. We carry beliefs that come from when we were young, when we started adapting, getting away from our true nature. And that sort of disconnection happens slowly, so we don't even realize it. And our ego's the protector, it's like it wants to protect us and it's trying to do that. But somewhere we feel a little bit off. And I think that's how it felt for me.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was at the beginning of my coaching journey and taking some of the first coaching classes, it was in person in Toronto. I sat all day in the class with the former NHL player from Toronto, and we did lots of exercises together. And he admitted, he's like, I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. I never worked. He literally said, I never worked before. And I said, what do you mean you never worked? You played how many years in the NHL? Like that's work. That's like freaking hard work. And he was like, it was not work. I was playing a game. It was like, so I felt like you get carried away from your childhood, playing on the streets, playing in the local rinks, and you carried all the way to NHL through years of NHL, and you still like realize that while you achieved all that athletic glory and financial success, and inside very often it's like you didn't mature, like you don't know who you are. And then it ends, and then it's like, okay, now what? Now like we need to figure it out. And I guess I'm curious to know, like, obviously this experience is different for everybody, like if that maturity kind of happens while you're playing and while you're going through that, career success in early years, that experience could be different. And I think that from what I understand, this is what you're trying to do right now with your mental fitness coaching work, is to get to work with kids, we call them kids, in their early 20s earlier, so they can have a different experience going through high performance elite sports. Tell us more about that.
Sure. Definitely think the starting point. I mean, you see players reinvent themselves. You know, some are GMs. I mean, and those who reinvent themselves have a strong sense of self, this authenticity. I think, to me, leadership is really like remaining true to yourself, authenticity, because it's simply reflected. You know, there's no like, I'm speaking like this to this person and differently to that. Okay, there's
Yeah.
different contexts. So for me, I think starting on this journey as kids, which you're like exposed to pressure, and there's so many distractions and people trying to pull you in and say, wow, you're great. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, who are you beyond those things? Who are you beyond those things? Because those things will come and go, just like everything. That's the impermanence of life. So, who are you? And really connect to that. You know, connect to the essence of who you are. And I think that's a great starting point. You know, of like staying grounded in that journey. So, you know, when you say the players that last the longest, I think they don't go too high or too low. They stay even keel.
Mm.
The basketball player in Ate Kumpo, I think he's Nigerian and Greek. Milwaukee, he plays for
Okay.
Milwaukee, and he says, I never, you know, I stay humble. I realize
Mm.
there's the next game all the time, so I never get too high, even if I had like a 40-point night, and I never get too low. And that's what allows him to be an elite performer. And I think that emotional poise, that sense of self, being, you know, true to yourself, realizing like, I get to perform, I get to do something I love. Like, I just don't want to do it one night good. I want to be excited for the next day. And life is like that. You're going to have to transition and then find something else that you're passionate about. But I guarantee you, playing sports for 20 years, there's a ton of skills that you've developed and that could be transferred into anything else. So I find coaching's, you know, something that um, you know, can help so many. Just what's important on this journey, and don't get too distracted by all these things. And I want to, you know, be able to do that through my story and helping people, like show them that you can have fun. You know, you can have fun even if there's high pressure. You can be yourself even if there's high pressure. And I think if I was to say authenticity vibrates,
Mm.
if you know the what's the book Power versus Force, they measure the vibrational force of emotions, while authenticity vibrates really high. So those things, that's where your experience will be like, it'll feel genuine and authentic, and it will feel rich.
Yeah.
So being true to yourself, I would say that's a good starting point.
Yeah. And it's not easy if you don't know who you are, right? Like you back to what you said, like you need to also know who your true self is. And the true self is free of those lies and stories. Because while authenticity and vulnerability became very popular and kind of like it's a good thing, let's do it, people misused it like anything else. There was like that performance vulnerability of oversharing, or authenticity, which ended up being just arrogance and people like being assholes. And they're just like, this is who I am, you know, I'm just being myself. But it's not their true self. Like it's kind of, it's a lot of coping stuff happening there, and they're masking a lot of things, and they're not even anywhere close knowing who they are at this point. So It's
I totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah. Somewhere we get lost in the power trip of, like, I mean, that's kind of the tools, and we know is the positive intelligence is the mental constructs of who you think you are, the automatic mental patterns versus who were you when you didn't have like all that conditioning going on. So I think to me what I really see is that we're either experiencing life in two ways where we're repeating patterns, and then you can predict how someone will react, the guy who's controlling, who needs to feel in power, he'll react the same way, the same way, the same way. And those are patterns. The people pleaser will react in the same way, the same way. Those are patterns. But then there's another way of experience life, which is spontaneous. It's like what is needed, and that's being tuned in. That's what children, they don't have. I like saying they don't have the data. So they're responding to life. They have a natural personality with strengths, but there's an openness. There's these
Yeah,
qualities.
their analytical powers, before puberty didn't come online yet. And it's interesting. I love the comparison to children, because it's so clear. At the same time, I almost sometimes find it's not a fair comparison because, like, anybody who didn't go through puberty and didn't have that hormonal upgrade to the brain that happens when all of a sudden we're able to make connections, to make, quite advanced conceptual thinking and abstract thinking. And, we just get so much of that analytical power installed in our brain. But then it becomes a liability. So it's kind of like we need to learn how to go back to that childhood sense of wonder and curiosity and being a fearlessness when it comes to learning and acting. And at the same time as we have access to this superpower of analytical brain. So, and that's exactly where your mental fitness coaching comes in, learning to kind of like how to navigate those levers. And just for our listeners and viewers, I just want to clarify, because we have a luxury of both being, I call it luxury because, it's just you learn so much about humans when you coach. We have a luxury of being coaches. So it means we, had a lot of training about human brain and human behavior. So lots of insights. You mentioned couple books. You mentioned Inner Game of Tennis. You mentioned Positive Intelligence. And I love that while on one hand, they're very different, but on the same hand, they have some similarities as to how they view, beautifully simplify our very complex brain and our very complex human self, physical self, as to having those two parts, self one and self two, when it comes to Inner Game of Tennis, when it's like that analytical thinking part versus that inner, deeper wisdom. And in Positive Intelligence, it's that left side of the brain with that's fear-based and does have analytical power, but also have a lot of those self-sabotaging patterns that kick in when we're in the fear, versus the right side of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the sage part, the self two. So, and basically we, as coaches and as humans, kind of need to have that awareness. We have those two parts. And we're more complex than that, but like, let's look at those two parts and then how to navigate between the two. So where should we go next? I'm thinking, anything comes up for you, maybe something you want to share, because I had quite a monologue.
Yeah, I think, information is great. I think of the analogy, makes me think of Jack Nicklaus. When I heard this one, it kind of knocked me back because I remember playing golf when I was starting out, and I was standing over the ball, and I was like going through all these things that I need to do, elbow in, and I it took me like 60 seconds to swing, and it becomes so mechanical, that there's no flow in it. And coming back to Jack Nicklaus, so he talked about his preparation in terms of percentage. So the intellect, he talked about like 40% he would work on his alignment, and his alignment would be, okay, it's good. You know this is the line I have to take to set up to hit the ball towards this target. So you have to use your mind to measure that.
Mm.
And then 50% would be to create a visual, so visualization of the shot shape, because that self too, it doesn't know language, it knows images. So you're imagining, and this is like even Einstein says imagination. Like think of all the things that were created, they all start in our imagination. So we have this superpower, that's our unconscious, our body's intelligence, whatever. And when you learn to use it correctly, well, that's what happens. You're having the image, and then you're not thinking, oh, what if something goes wrong? You're
Mhm.
holding. And then he said 10%, I just went, and then one, two, three, I swing. And there was no concept of this has to go. It's just swing the club. Like not even like, oh, it has to go. It's like trust that you've done it so many times. There's this operating system that will take care of it. And we go back to interference. Well, we're talking about interferences.
Hesitation.
Yeah, the,
Okay.
the the personal self, too much involvement of the personal self, I call. And then all of a sudden, it's like there's all these scenarios that come into play that were not there and are not meant to be there, because your focus is a gift. You have the ability to focus on what you want to focus. But because we have all those patterns, our focus gets hijacked, and it goes to, okay, worst case scenario, or this and this. And it activates fear, the survival part of the brain. And then all of a sudden, our experience, we get tight and we have anxiety. And I mean, you can have a little bit of those
Mhm.
emotions, but when they consume you, then it's a way, honestly, you're not going to access your full potential.
Yeah. Yeah. I last week, my swim coach on deck gave me feedback saying like my stroke is getting is correct, because a couple of weeks prior to that I had some stroke correction. So he said, your stroke is great, you're doing everything right. But he's like, you're so stiff, you're so rigid. I can see that you're thinking about your stroke. I was like, you can see I'm thinking from the deck. And he's like, oh yeah, like I can totally see. You're so like you're robotic, you're mechanical there. And you just like you need to now relax, like and I messaged my triathlon coach saying, like now what do I do to relax in the water? And he's like, just keep putting the reps, keep putting the reps. Sometimes in certain situations, like you just keep doing it, like you enough time and it's just gonna become fluid. So,
And that goes back to what we talked about, trust,
mm,
trusting the process, trusting, like, I mean, imagine you were a little embryo, you were little Yulia, I was little Adrian, trusting the process. And I think that is really a key, I think, in really having what I would say peak experience, not only
mm,
peak performance, but peak experience, which is the success with the fulfillment. I mean, many coaches talk about it. I think notably Tony Robbins says success without fulfillment isn't success, it's the ultimate failure. you know,
Mm.
and it resonates with me because that was my experience a lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah, and the fulfillment comes from that connection to the moment, connection to the experience, connection to like yourself. And because if we are like performing in the way that robotic way and high pressure and even like on the scoreboard, it's like, yeah, we're number one and or we're on the podium. But at the same time, well, okay, it's great for sponsors.
Good.
But for us, it's like, ugh, and yeah, I don't feel any different. Yeah. So I like that you mentioned the differentiation between peak performance and peak experience. So building on that, I want to ask you the difference between, at least how you see it, the difference between mental toughness and mental mastery.
Mm. Well, I think mental toughness is from the way I experience is like you push through everything. So it's your ego. It's like you feel the resistance and you have to push through it. And I think there is, I mean, think about when you go to the gym, you go to the gym and you're pushing weight, there's a resistance. So there is a load and it's hard. And for me, the difference is what's happening inside. You know,
Mm,
that's all that is. So mental toughness is like I'm like fighting myself, and that makes it even more hard versus someone who's in, mental freedom, mental mastery is like, okay, wow, this
mm,
is hard. This feels different, it's resistant, and I almost know it's good for me. Like, how can I approach this and like let go and totally accept that if it's different, there's a load, and it's just the approach, it's the way you show up. And I think that's all of a sudden when you get into flow, because now all of a sudden, yeah, you're doing some incredible feat and it looks effortless and people go, what the hell, how can they do that? So I think it's really in the mind, it's in the mind that it's happening. And so
yeah.
toughness is just sort of, I think, a buzzword
Yeah.
we learned in hockey, and for sure. But I would definitely say mental freedom, bringing that stillness and bringing that. So getting the inner, calming that, and then, you know, being able to push through, or learn to go with the current,
Yeah.
and it's push pull energy again, in PQ, they talk about push and pull energy, which feels a whole lot different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We obviously will always have initial resistance and something to push through at the beginning of doing something hard, but it doesn't need to be hard. Doesn't need to be hard the whole way. Like
Correct.
it's hard to make that first step, so you kind of like step through that barrier, but then you kind of like enter that a superpower state. Because I find when I know, at least for myself, when I just push with my physical resources and like mental, pure mental resolve, it's limited. Like I
Mm,
have limited physical energy and physical abilities, but at the same time, when I kind of let go, as you described, let go of that resistance and have a vision, you know, and I often have a vision like, okay, I really want to complete this,
mm,
bike workout in my trainer without lowering the power, like I really want to not skip any intervals. I don't want to lower a power. And I was like, I'm just like, help me. Like, I can do it. I visualize it. I can do it. And I was like, okay, just carry me through. And I kind of let it go, see what happens. And it
mm.
happens. I
Yeah.
finish it without lowering the power. But if I
Yes.
sit there, I can do it and like stress out about how hard it is. Well, guess what? It's gonna get harder.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
gonna get harder. And then I had one. I just want to share, a personal experience of that, like letting go. I was doing a long, really pretty long training run, and I was at the end of my physical and mental abilities at this point. I was like, I am taking Uber home. Forget it. Like I'm done. And then I started talking to my higher power, saying, listen, if you want me to finish this workout, you need to help me. I am tapped out, like I'm done, like I'm going home. So if you, and and the reason I was having difficulties is because it got hotter, like outside than I expected. So like I'm dehydrated. It's more difficult to run in the heat. And I'm like, help me. Okay. So I surrendered. I let go. I was like, I'm calling Uber. I'm done. And then within 5 minutes, and I'm running by the river, there is a woman walking by and she has a pink t-shirt and it says, expect miracles. I'm like, I was like, okay, I will expect miracles. And I kind of laughed. Within the next couple minutes, the wind picks up from the river, the clouds come in, and it started like drizzling rain. Everybody runs away. It gets colder because there is a cold wind from the river. It started drizzling, so I cooled down. I had to like untie my jacket from my waist, put it back because I started getting kind of chilly, and I was like, thank you. And I finished. And it's kind of like one of my stories when you said like you have enough pain, you just like sometimes like, yes, I'm ready to change, but sometimes it's just like I'm giving up. But giving up in the way carry me through. And and that's I find not often used, even by me, who tells all these stories. I have other stories like, do I always do it? No, I forget. And I asked one coach, I said, how many athletes do you see truly tap into that flow state and having like that ability to let go and access that freedom to to access the next level of performance? Like, what is in your experience, how, like, what is it's like, is everybody who is super successful can do it? And he's like, well, no, 10%. So everybody else grinds it down. And so I found it's interesting. It's just very absolutely fascinating, like everybody has their own way to get there, but we can't get there without help.
I agree.
From people like you. So, what, I have a question for you just to go back into your NHL past. Knowing what you know now, with your, later in life learning and tools and approach that you have now to help athletes and coaches and parents of those athletes, what you would have done different?
Yeah, I think if I was speaking to my 20-year-old self, um, I would have, relaxed a little bit more and just trusted myself. So knowing that, I did the work, and then, having the confidence and faith, and ultimately that's what confidence is, you know, like stop trying so hard, stop forcing things, just trust the process, and I think it really happens. I would, turn off the mind and you know develop and cultivate more stillness. And I think, doing the things that I'm doing now, just making that of really part of my daily routine of not just working the physical body, but working the mind, and understanding that that is so important in the way you're going to experience things, and also your longevity due injuries and all these things. So, you know, like you said, removing the interference that gets in the way. So I would definitely, be working the mind as much. Well, obviously the physical is so important in ice hockey and any other sport, but working the mind and really going a little bit deeper in that inner work, to be able to, I think that's where you unlock a lot of your potential. And I would be way more present, because I realize it's all about, you know, your the people you share this with, the things you're going to remember is like, well, how did you make people feel? Those shared experience. I would spend so much more time connecting with others, whether it's my teammates and staying in touch and sharing my moments with family and also learning what's their moments like, what's their life is going on. And sometimes as an athlete you're just so consumed by yourself and having to perform, and it becomes a prison. So I would change that, and I would continuously invest in the future self. So
Mm.
knowing that one day you're going to have to reinvent yourself and doing things that are, in like what's interesting for me as well. So not just being one dimensional to one thing, but now exploring new things. And I think creating a network and staying in touch with people, that because there's so many people that I was exposed to, and often we lose contact. So I don't know, in a nutshell.
Yeah,
uh,
it's engagement. What I'm hearing you talk, and I think it's being more engaged with the world around you,
yes.
being more engaged, not, like not only focusing on results and not only focusing on yourself, which is becomes very selfish, right?
Mm.
And but like diffusing that kind of almost like feels like you can diffuse the pressure by engaging with others,
The
and also
personal
thinking
self,
this is. Mm?
the personal self again is like, oh, who's the teammate next to you? Do you
Yeah,
actually know him? So actually connecting
yeah,
with your teammates and yeah, you realize you
yeah, we
can.
learn so much about ourselves by being with others, because people, obviously it's important, and I did it in my life too, even recently, kind of isolate for a little bit to kind of like get a little bit space for myself, like to be with myself. It's useful, but I don't think we discover that much when we're by ourselves, honest. I came to a conclusion. Yes, time alone is important. It's important because to remove the stimulation, kind of like to decompress from that adrenaline or stimulation or being distracted. Yes, it's good to bring focus to ourselves. But ultimately, that's not when we discover who we are. We discover who we are in interactions, in engagement with the world.
Sure, sure. And I think sometimes that contrast of isolating yourself, like if you're someone who depends so much on others, and always needing, sometimes it's good to go,
Yeah.
to, the self and go, okay, can I, you know, make a decision by myself, or just be. So I think it depends, it always depends, but yeah, obviously, the studies are out that people who have strong connections live longer. So I think on an average 10 years longer than people who don't. So, and I think there's a bit of a isolation and a loneliness epidemic, that's
Mm,
happening too. So yeah, these are
yeah.
things, yeah, you hear.
Excellent. Yeah. So, what was the toughest decision that you had to make in your career?
Wow, I'm sure there was a lot. I think of two. When I was at University of New Hampshire, I had a scholarship, so they recruited me, and I was supposed to stay 4 years, and I stayed one. With real insight, I needed more maturity. Looking back, I would have taken that time. I think often we try to rush things or rush towards our dream and things like that. So I definitely feel that, having the holistic approach, seeing yourself as a human being first, that's so important, and then understanding that, and that when the human being's good, when you're good, everything else that will feed into everything else, your life as an
Mhm.
athlete, your relationships. So I definitely would revisit that decision. I think that's the one that sort of, stands out. And I think I would have, like, when there was moments where I went down to the minors, or I looked at something as a sort of like, oh, you evaluate, you say, oh, wow, this means that, like, because you've taken a step back. But often, sometimes a step back is needed to make that next step forward. So, again, what you said, being more engaged in everything that happens, even the challenges and the setbacks, because I think they're really opportunities in disguise. And yeah, so those are things, I think, one specifically, and the other one was more of a general thing that I shared.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So looking into the future, what is something that you really want, but you kind of think is maybe not possible?
Well, I think it is possible, actually. I mean, you hear of the stories, like we're passed on so much wisdom, from the Buddha, and from sages who've mastered the mind. I think we all have, a past, we all have experience, but I think we can be free of the charge that is, associated. So when I think of, like, I shared, like, living in patterns, that you're free of that. You have the experience that comes from everything you learned, but you go back to that original nature where the day in front of you is fresh, it's new, it's not weighed down by things that have happened in the past. And I think that would solve a lot of issues in the world. But I think ultimately, I think that's our nature. It's our nature to be free, to wake up and go, am I actually seeing the image of the tree of that person, the image that I have of them? Or am I actually seeing, the person? So that's what I mean, of that sense of freedom. And I think that's sort of, you got to clean up, and get the mind right, get everything internal right. So that would be the thing that I think is maybe impossible, or a little
But you really
far-fetched.
want, Adrian, are you trying to become an enlightened master?
No, I wouldn't call it. No, I just, yeah. Um, so yeah, I feel like that would be the ultimate freedom, and the thing that I was looking for, when I played. So it's like, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because it's like, yeah, I heard somebody, a very successful writer, talk about like how she was chasing, her enlightenment and her like ultimate freedom and she went to all these gurus and she did all this, like meditation, and she's highly, highly, highly like super successful, like as successful as you can be as an author. And she was chasing that enlightenment. And at the end of the day, she said, like when she connected with her inner wisdom, the guidance was that it's not her path. Not everybody's here to be kind of Buddha or a teacher of that level of Eckhart Tolle or something, And it's like we're here to be in the mud of human experience with all the setbacks, with all the losses, with all the falling down, because the whole point is like that getting up and getting up. And we're like, but we just want to get enlightened and like get all our, high
No,
performance, high experience, and then we're good, we're safe, we're immune to adversity.
I think that yeah, maybe if something came to me, it's like what Shakespeare said, to be or not to be.
Mm,
I want to be, I want to be in the world and I want to be present, even though there's always going to be challenges. It's just the nature of life. But are you are you being while this is going on? And that's, like you said, being engaged and present in the moment. So I think that's really, what I think the desire is, just to reproduce that more and more. And that's sort of possible because you have those experiences. And wow, it's rich when you're fully present with someone. Even like this interview
yeah,
feels like it's flying by, because I'm
yeah.
full. So I guess you made me
Well,
rephrase it.
it is flying by, so we need to wrap it up. So tell everybody how they can find you and where they can learn more, how they can work with you, and please.
So the easiest way is Adrian Plavsic. So AdrienPlavsic.com. So
Okay.
that's my website. And LinkedIn is also, if you tap in my name, you'll see I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. Those are the two easiest ways to reach out to me.
Excellent. And so you currently live in Switzerland, like
Yes.
you're in Europe, but I know like you're obviously you're Canadian, you come to Canada, you do work here as well, and you do virtual work. So you're completely accessible to, you're open for business
In
everywhere.
Canada, I want to be in Canada more and more because I
You
think,
do? Okay.
yeah, it's, yeah.
So anybody who's listening who has, good projects for Adrian to come to Canada, please get in touch. Well, thank you so much. This was just so great to touch on, high performance, high experience, and all the interference that gets in between, us getting there. So thank you for this time very
Thank
much.
you. I enjoyed myself very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else that maybe left unsaid before we completely say goodbye?
No, I think, yeah, anybody who's, struggling, really realize it's the struggle sometimes is needed, to get you to the other side. Through that contrast, you get to experience freedom because there's a wanting. So just trusting the process. I think that would be my message.
Run towards the struggle, basically. And contact Adrian.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. Until next time. Oh, trying to pause.